I recently lived through what can only be described as my worst nightmare, the kind that shreds your nerves and leaves you shaking. The son of the HOA president, without a word, decided to borrow my cherished Mustang, the one I had poured my soul into for years. His excuse? He was just taking it for a spin with his buddies. The only thing spinning that day was the rage boiling inside me when he returned it, completely totaled. But let me take you back to the moment it all began. I walked into my garage expecting comfort, only to find a gaping void where my '67 classic Mustang should have been. No oil-scented air, no gleaming chrome under the lights, just a lifeless slab of concrete and the deafening echo of my own heartbeat as panic set in. I stood frozen, blinking, trying to convince myself it was just fatigue or some cruel illusion. But it wasn't. My car, my father's car, was gone. Years of weekend rebuilds, scraped knuckles, and late-night tinkering vanished in a single, gut-wrenching moment. That Mustang was more than a machine. It was my legacy, a piece of my family's soul. And now, some arrogant punk had stolen it right from my own garage. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers, my mind already spiraling through worst-case scenarios, until I heard it, laughter. Not just any laughter, but the obnoxious, smug cackle that could only belong to Kyle, the spoiled son of Karen, the self-appointed queen of our neighborhood and reigning HOA tyrant. My fury exploded as I stormed out, each step heavier than the last. And there he was, standing on the sidewalk with his equally smug friends, twirling my Mustang keys on his finger like they were a toy. My keys, the ones with the silver pony fob I got for my birthday. The sight was so bold, so insulting, it didn't just ignite my rage, it vaporized my fear. I didn't yell. I didn't scream. The words that came out were low, tight, and dangerous. "Where is my car?" The laughter died instantly. Kyle's grin remained, smug and entitled. He stood there, tall and skinny, draped in arrogance like a designer coat. "Oh, hey," he said casually, like we were just neighbors chatting over coffee. "We just took it for a spin. It was just sitting there." And then, like it was nothing, he tossed the keys toward me. I caught them, more out of instinct than anything else, my hand moving before my mind could catch up. The metal was still warm when I caught the keys, a mocking reminder of how recently my car had been violated. "You should really lock your garage, man," Kyle said, his voice dripping with arrogance as his friends snickered behind him like a pack of hyenas. My hands curled into fists, the temptation to wipe that smug grin off his face almost overwhelming. But I knew better. Hitting a teenager, especially this teenager, wasn't justice. It was a trap that would only end badly for me. I was angry, yes, but I wasn't stupid. I took a breath, slow and deep, the air scraping my lungs like sandpaper. "Where's my car?" I asked again, each word spaced like bullets. Kyle lazily pointed his thumb over his shoulder. "Down the block. We brought it back," he said, already turning to his friends. "Come on, let's go. My mom's making tacos." And just like that, they walked away, laughing and carefree, while I stood frozen, the keys digging into my palm and a storm roaring inside my chest. I started down the street, each step heavier than the last, dread tightening around me like a noose. And then I saw her, my Mustang. But she wasn't parked neatly by the curb. No, she was half on the sidewalk, crushing the edge of Mrs. Henderson's award-winning petunias, looking like a wounded animal dumped after a hit-and-run. The front passenger fender was crumpled inwards like it had been sucker-punched by a truck, the sleek black paint scraped down to raw, jagged metal. A long, brutal scratch ran along the entire door like a scar. My gut twisted. I moved closer, horror stacking with every detail. When I opened the driver's side door, it wasn't that familiar scent of old leather and polished chrome that greeted me. Instead, it was the rancid stench of stale fast food, cheap cologne, and something sickeningly sweet. There was a dark, sticky stain soaking into the passenger seat, maybe soda, maybe something worse, ruining the leather I had spent weeks conditioning by hand. The floor mats were a muddy mess, and on the back seat, a greasy pizza box sat next to a crushed bag of chips ground deep into the upholstery like an insult. My car, my pride, my passion, my legacy, had been treated like a filthy dumpster. I leaned my head against the roof, the cold metal biting into my skin, eyes shut tight. The fire that had burned in me moments ago was freezing over, turning into something far more dangerous, a heavy, bitter certainty. They thought this was funny. They thought they could take what was mine, trash it, and walk away without consequences. But they were wrong. Very, very wrong. Their biggest mistake wasn't stealing my car, and it wasn't even wrecking it beyond recognition. It was assuming I was the kind of man who would just grit his teeth and move on, who would let it slide like nothing ever happened. As I stood there staring at what used to be my pride and joy, surrounded by the pristine, plastic perfection of the neighborhood, I realized something had shifted. Karen and her smug little prince hadn't just crossed a line. They'd set the whole field on fire, and they didn't even realize they were standing knee-deep in gasoline. This wasn't going to end with a police report or some soulless back and forth with an insurance agent. No, this was personal now. This was war. And I was going to scorch everything they held dear. My first stop wasn't the police. It was Karen's house. I needed to see her face, hear the twisted logic she'd used to defend the indefensible, and feel the weight of her arrogance firsthand. I walked up her meticulously maintained stone path, past her ridiculous live, laugh, love sign like. It was some kind of shield against reality, and rang the doorbell. The door swung open, and there she was, Karen herself, clutching a spatula like a scepter, wearing a frozen, too tight smile that didn't touch the dead shark, eyes staring back at me. "Can I help you?" she asked sweetly, like she didn't already know why I was there. "Your son took my car," I said evenly, "and he wrecked it." She didn't blink. "Oh, that," she said, waving the spatula like she was swatting a fly. "Kyle told me. It was just a little misunderstanding. Boys will be boys, you know." That phrase hit me like a punch to the chest. So careless, so infuriatingly hollow. And then she doubled down. "You leave your garage open all the time. Honestly, that's practically an invitation. You should be more careful." I couldn't believe it. She was actually blaming me, for what her entitled brat had done. The arrogance was staggering, like watching someone spit in your face and then hand you a napkin. "He stole my car and destroyed it, Karen. That's not boys being boys. That's a felony," I said, my voice barely containing the storm. Her expression changed instantly. The smile vanished, her eyes sharpened, and she jabbed the spatula at my chest like a warning. "Now listen here," she snapped. "I won't have you threatening my son. He's a good boy. He made a mistake. If there's any damage, which I'm sure is minor, just send me the bill." She started to close the door with that same smug finality, saying, "Now, if you'll excuse me, my family is waiting for their dinner." But I wasn't done, not by a long shot. I put my hand against the door, stopping it from shutting. "This isn't something a bill is going to fix, Karen," I said coldly. Her eyes narrowed into razor-thin slits, full of venom. "Get your hand off my door, or I'll call the police and tell them you're harassing me," she hissed. I pulled my hand back slowly. I knew she wasn't bluffing. I could practically hear the lies assembling in her head like soldiers in formation. I didn't say another word, just gave her a long, silent look, one that carried a promise she didn't yet understand, and walked away. Her door slammed behind me like the punctuation on a threat. That's when I called the police. A young, exhausted-looking officer arrived, took my statement, inspected the car, and let out a quiet sigh that said more than his words ever could. He nodded, said he'd go have a word with the family, but I already knew what that meant. Karen would twist the story into some sugar-coated lie, claim it was all a misunderstanding, and nothing meaningful would come of it. The system? Slow, sluggish, bound by red tape and paperwork. But I wasn't. They thought a few smooth lies and a check would make this disappear. They didn't realize who they were dealing with. This wasn't just about a car. This was about legacy, about love, about a promise I swore I'd keep. That Mustang wasn't metal and rubber to me. It was the last living piece of my father. He bought it brand new in '67, the year he came home from serving, and that beast of a machine became his pride, his symbol of freedom and strength. I grew up riding shotgun. The scent of vinyl and gasoline burned into my memories as deeply as the classic rock that poured from the radio while we cruised down long country roads. He taught me how to drive in that car, how to change the oil, gap the spark plugs, tune the engine by ear. "A man's got to know how to fix the things he loves," he'd say, handing me tools with oil-stained hands. When he got sick, the Mustang stayed parked. He was too weak to drive and too proud to let anyone else touch the wheel. In one of our last real conversations, he looked me dead in the eyes and rasped, "Don't ever sell the pony. You keep her running. You keep her beautiful." After he passed, the car became my therapy, my project, my sacred bond to him. It was a wreck when I started, but it gave me purpose, something to fix when everything else felt broken. Years of sitting untouched had left the Mustang in rough shape. Faded paint dulled by time, rust creeping along the fenders like a disease, and an engine that hadn't breathed fire in over a decade. My best friend Alex took one look at the dusty relic in my garage and shook his head. "You're crazy," he said. "Just buy a new car, man. Something reliable. This thing's a money pit." But it was never about the money. I ran my hand over the hood, feeling the weight of the past pressed into the metal. "It's about the promise," I told him. Alex, ever the loyal friend, didn't fully understand, but he didn't walk away either. He's a practical guy, a lawyer who sees the world in legal contracts, risk assessments, and black and white logic. Me? I see life in shades of honor and principle, of right and wrong. He thought I was wasting my time, but he still rolled up his sleeves and helped. Me anyway. For the next 3 years, almost every weekend, we lived in that garage. We pulled the engine, bolt by bolt, and rebuilt it from the ground up. I taught myself bodywork, sanding off rust, shaping panels, smoothing out years of wear. I learned to paint, spraying coat after meticulous coat of gloss black until the Mustang shimmered like liquid obsidian. I hand-stitched the leather seats, each needle pass a quiet tribute to my dad's memory. Every inch of that car was forged in grit, soaked in sweat, and stitched with love. When I finally turned the key and the engine roared to life, its sound echoed through the neighborhood like a war cry, raw and beautiful. Alex stood beside me, eyes wide, a grin slowly spreading across his face. "Okay," he said, nodding. "I get it now. That car wasn't just my connection to the past. It was my sanctuary. It gave me peace, a sense of purpose. It wasn't about speed or show. It was about control, about feeling every vibration in the wheel, every rumble in my chest, knowing that I had brought this powerful machine back from the grave with my own 2 hands. It was more than a possession. It was a piece of me, something sacred. Our neighborhood used to be peaceful too, a quiet place where everyone minded their business and life moved slow. But then Karen was elected HOA president, and everything changed. It started small, passive-aggressive notes about trash cans being left out a few minutes too long, absurd fines for grass growing just a hair too high. But the petty rules multiplied, and soon, it felt like we were living under a microscope. Karen thrived on control, on power. You could see it in the smug glint of her eyes during HOA meetings as she sat at the head of the table like royalty, handing out violations like royal decrees. I'd had a single run-in with Karen before the Mustang incident, and looking back, it should have been the warning flare I didn't ignore. It happened during an HOA meeting when I dared to question a sudden spike in our monthly fees. I simply asked to see a detailed budget, something any reasonable resident would want. Karen's smile tightened into a cold, plastic grin, and she shot me a look of pure venom. "The budget is perfectly fine," she said, her voice like ice. "If you can't afford to live here, perhaps you should consider moving." The room went dead silent. No one dared to support me, not because they agreed with her, but because they were afraid. I let it go in the moment, but I didn't forget the way she looked at me. It was a silent promise, a warning. "I'll remember this." And she did. Then, there was Louis, my elderly neighbor. Retired accountant, harmless as a bunny, and constantly fussing over his backyard garden gnome army. He's terrified of pretty much everything: confrontation, thunderstorms, even squirrels. Louis sees everything that happens on our street from behind his lace curtains, but wouldn't get involved if the house next door were on fire. Sometimes, when I was out polishing the Mustang, he'd shuffle over and whisper like he was leaking top secret information. "She's a real bee," he'd mutter, eyes darting toward Karen's house. My brother had one of those. A 68. Not as pretty as yours, though. He was the neighborhood's gentle ghost, a harmless observer too scared to speak up. But when I stood there staring at the wreckage of my Mustang, the whole picture clicked into place. Karen's hunger for control, her petty grudge against me, her golden boy son who thought the world owed him. This wasn't just a joyride gone wrong. This was a statement. This was Karen, through her son, trying to break something sacred to me. A warning to stay in my lane, to keep my mouth shut, and my head down. But what she didn't realize is that destroying my car wasn't just property damage. It was a direct hit to my father's memory. And that wasn't something I could forgive. A colder, sharper part of me took over. The fury was still there, roaring beneath the surface, but now it had a direction, a purpose. They had stepped over a line that couldn't be uncrossed. And I made a new promise, not to my dad, but to myself. I wasn't just going to get justice. I was going to dismantle everything Karen had built, brick by smug brick. She thought she was the queen of this little suburban kingdom, but she was about to learn what it felt like to be powerless, to be ruled instead of ruling. This was her world, her rules, her throne, and I was about to flip the entire board. 1 week after the so-called joyride, the official letter arrived. The envelope arrived on a Thursday, crisp and white, with the Homeowners Association logo embossed in the corner like a corporate seal of doom. I already knew it wasn't going to be an apology, and I certainly didn't expect a check to cover the damage. But even with my expectations at rock bottom, I wasn't prepared for the audacity stuffed inside. I slid it open with my thumb, already feeling my stomach tighten. The paper inside was thick, unnecessarily formal, and reeked of smug bureaucracy. It wasn't a letter of remorse. It was a bill, a fine, and not for Karen or her son, for me. My eyes scanned the page, and I could feel the heat rise in my neck, followed by the chill of disbelief. 2 charges. The first, a $200 fine for maintaining a non-operational vehicle in public view. They were fining me for the state of my wrecked Mustang, the car her son had destroyed. The arrogance behind it was staggering. It was like being charged for bleeding after someone slashed your throat. But it got worse. The second fine was $50 for improper storage of automotive parts. I was confused until I read the fine print. Apparently, a piece of the front fender had been found detached and lying on the community-owned sidewalk. The same piece that had been ripped off during Kyle's joyride. The same piece I had carefully retrieved and placed inside my garage for safekeeping. They had turned that into a violation. I dropped the letter on the kitchen table and just laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that carried no humor, just raw disbelief. This was her move, Karen's calculated counterattack. Not only was she refusing to take responsibility, she was flipping the script, painting me as the problem. That night, Alex came over. I handed him the letter without a word. He read it, eyebrows arching high as he flipped through each page. "This is insane," he muttered, shaking his head. "Legally indefensible. You can fight this, Jack." I nodded slowly, my voice a low, focused growl. "Oh, I'm going to fight it. I'm going to fight all of it." He leaned forward, that lawyer fire sparking in his eyes. "Good. The next HOA meeting's Thursday. You go. Present your case calmly, rationally. Bring pictures of the damage. Bring the police report number. Bring a copy of this absurd letter. Lying on the sidewalk, a piece that was torn off during the theft committed by your son." The room went still. Not quiet, still. The kind of silence that hangs heavy and cold, where you can feel people holding their breath. Karen's expression didn't flinch, but her eyes flickered, just for a second. I continued, steady and clear, not raising my voice, but making sure every word hit its mark. "I have here the police report number, my written statement, and this," I said, tapping the thick envelope from the restoration shop, "an official estimate from a certified specialist. The cost to restore my car is nearly $25,000. That's what it takes to repair a legacy after it's been trashed in a joyride by someone who had no right to touch it." I looked directly at Karen. And instead of helping resolve this, instead of offering any apology or accountability, "You sent me a fine. You fined me for having my property destroyed." I let the words settle. Then I turned to face the rest of the room, scanning the hesitant, weary faces of my neighbors. I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm asking for fairness. I'm asking this board to rescind these absurd fines, to acknowledge what actually happened, and to hold the right person accountable. We can't let fear of one person keep us from doing what's right. Alex had believed that facts would win, that truth would rise if you just presented it properly. I wasn't so sure, but I had to try. I had to show that I'd taken the high road, that I'd followed every rule, every process, every step. I looked around and saw a few heads nodding, people shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Karen stayed frozen, her voice tight as piano wire. "You're turning this into a public spectacle," she said, feigning calm. "You're making baseless accusations against my family." "No," I said, holding up the folder one more time. "I'm presenting evidence. And if this board refuses to acknowledge it, I'll take it higher. Civil court, news outlets, whatever it takes." Karen's mouth opened, but no words came out. And in that moment, I realized something had changed. Her control, her grip over this room, it had cracked, just a little. The illusion was starting to falter. The queen wasn't invincible, and I wasn't alone anymore. Falling off the edge of my patience, I stood tall, voice steady, and delivered. The final part of my appeal. "I'm here tonight to formally contest this fine and to ask the HOA to accept responsibility for the actions of the president's son." I had done exactly what Alex advised, presented the facts, stayed calm, kept emotion in check. I looked around the room, searching for even the faintest glimmer of solidarity in someone's eyes, but all I found was fear. Neighbors suddenly obsessed with their shoes, the ceiling, their own breath. No one dared to meet my gaze. Karen glanced at the photos and the estimate with icy indifference, pushed them back toward me without so much as a blink. "The fine stands," she said coolly, her voice void of remorse. "The bylaws are very clear regarding the condition of vehicles. As for your other complaint, that is a private matter between you and my family. The HOA has no involvement." I felt my composure fray. "No involvement," I repeated, my voice rising despite my effort to remain composed. "You're the president of the HOA. Your son acted like he was above the rules because of you. And now you're using your position to punish me for what he did." Her mask cracked for just a second before she snapped. "That's enough," slamming her tiny gavel onto the table with a sharp, smug finality. "You are out of order. This is not the place for personal vendettas. If you have a problem, take it up with our lawyer." She looked out over the sea of bowed heads and blank stares. "The appeal is denied. Now, if there's no other new business, this meeting is adjourned." And just like that, it was over. She had shut me down, dismissed my evidence, erased my voice, and made a mockery of justice right in front of the very people she ruled over with fear. I stood there, folder in hand, the photographs and statements that had cost me hours to compile, now meaningless scraps. The room emptied quickly, neighbors scurrying away like they might be guilty by proximity if they lingered too long. I was left standing alone in the echoing hall with Karen, her obedient husband Bob, and her ever-nodding sidekick Carol, their stares cold and victorious. Alex had been wrong. The system wasn't just broken, it was hers. It was a carefully crafted weapon she wielded to control, to punish, to silence. Working within it was never going to win. I walked out of that hall with something burning in my chest. Not rage, not anymore, but a white-hot clarity. The rational approach had failed. Now it was time for the other side of me to take over. The side that knew how to think 5 moves ahead. The side that could be clever, quiet, and absolutely relentless. Karen wanted to play by her own rules. Fine. But I was about to rewrite the entire rulebook, and in my version of the game, Karen wasn't just going to lose. She was going to regret ever sitting on that throne. Tyre, his eyes darting nervously as if simply watching me could get him in trouble. I gave him a nod, a silent acknowledgement, and to my surprise, later that evening, he shuffled up to my porch with his usual hunched posture and a plastic container of cookies. "Brought you something," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. I invited him in, and after a few awkward minutes of small talk, he leaned in and whispered, "I saw Kyle the night your trash cans got knocked over." I didn't want to get involved, but he trailed off, wringing his hands. That was all I needed, confirmation, not just suspicion. Louis had finally crossed his threshold of fear, and it gave me hope that maybe others could, too. The war was on, and yes, I had lost the first battle in that meeting, but I knew with an unshakable certainty that I would not lose the last. The humiliation I had felt that night had calcified into something much colder, determination. This wasn't just about a car anymore. It was about standing up to power abused without consequence. Karen had declared herself queen of our quiet little kingdom, twisting rules to serve her will and daring anyone to challenge her. So my first move was to study those rules, every letter of them. I went to the HOA website and downloaded everything: covenants, conditions, restrictions, bylaws, budgets, even the last 5 years of meeting minutes. It was dry, convoluted, and intentionally opaque. Pages and pages of legal boilerplate. But I wasn't intimidated. I turned my kitchen into a war room, buried under highlighters, sticky notes, and steaming mugs of black coffee. Every night after work, I read line by line, hunting for inconsistencies, vulnerabilities, leverage. Alex called daily. "You talked to a lawyer yet?" he'd ask. "You have a real case, Jack?" Civil court could destroy her. But I wasn't ready. Not yet. "I'm doing the groundwork," I told him. "I want to know the battlefield before I bring in artillery." He warned me to be careful. "Don't let your temper get the best of you." I laughed and said, "My temper's the only thing keeping me warm right now." And it wasn't a joke. That fury had become fuel. As I dug deeper, oddities started surfacing. A 30% increase in the landscaping budget 2 years ago, no detailed breakdown. A vague $15,000 line item labeled Community Enhancement Project, no description. Meeting minutes that read like propaganda, with phrases like discussion, held, and no further questions, covering every controversial point. The deeper I went, the more corrupt it all looked. And right when I was hitting a wall, the petty game started. One morning I found my trash cans knocked over, garbage spread like a message. Days later, a gleaming nail embedded in the sidewall of my truck's tire, right where it would do the most damage. I didn't need proof, I knew. It was Kyle, Karen's little attack dog, doing his mother's dirty work. They were trying to provoke me, bait me into exploding, so she could paint me as unstable. But I didn't bite. And that's when Louis stepped forward, watching me from behind his blinds. He had seen more than he let on, and eventually, guilt, or maybe decency, got the better of him. That one timid admission from Louis meant more than he realized, because with it, the tide started to shift. I wasn't fighting this alone anymore. A few minutes after I noticed the nail in my truck tire, Louis darted across his lawn like a jittery squirrel dodging traffic, clutching a garden gnome to his chest as if it could protect him from whatever haunted him. Despite the empty street, he hissed in a whisper, "I saw something," his eyes wide and scanning the surroundings. Without looking up from the lug nuts, I asked, "What did you see, Louis?" He leaned in, lowering his voice even more. "Last night," he said, swallowing hard. "My sciatica was flaring up, and I couldn't sleep. I saw Kyle, the president's boy, over here, right by your truck. He had something in his hand. I couldn't tell what it was dark, but he was crouched. Exactly where your tire is now." I paused, tightening the last nut. "Would you be willing to tell the police that, Louis?" His face drained of color, and he hugged his gnome like it was his last lifeline. "No, I can't. Karen would ruin me. She already threatened me over the height of my petunias. Please don't tell her I said anything." His voice cracked, on the verge of tears. I sighed, torn between sympathy and irritation. "Don't worry, Louis. Your secret's safe with me." He nodded gratefully and scurried back to his house, leaving me alone with a storm of thoughts. His fear was exactly what Karen thrived on. She ruled this neighborhood like a petty dictator, using fear, fines, and HOA violations to keep everyone in line. Nobody dared stand up to her, and that's why she held all the power. But I realized then that a simple lawsuit wouldn't cut it. I needed to dismantle her control completely and expose the truth to everyone. Show them the queen had no clothes. That nail in my tire wasn't just vandalism, it was a declaration. I had to act. That weekend, I bought a top-of-the-line security system, 4 high-definition, night vision cameras. I spent all of Saturday carefully mounting them, one facing the driveway and garage, another watching over the front lawn and door, a third aimed down the street toward Karen's house, and the last fixed tightly on the side of my home. Covering every angle I could dot, I aimed the final camera to cover the exact spot where Kyle had crouched, and as I tightened the last bracket, I felt a small but satisfying surge of control returning to me. Karen and Kyle were watching from their window, Kyle wearing that same smug grin that made my blood boil, and Karen with a cold, unreadable expression. Let them stare. I wanted them to know that I was watching now, too. After syncing the cameras to my phone and computer, I checked each feed and was stunned by the clarity. Every rustling leaf, every shadow across the pavement was sharp as glass. The air felt charged, heavy with unspoken hostility. Our once tranquil suburb had transformed into a silent battleground, and I was firmly entrenched on one side, facing off against Karen and her pampered prince. The rest of the neighborhood? Nervous bystanders, caught in a war they pretended not to see. That night, I sat alone in the dark, lit only by the glow of my laptop screen, watching the live feeds like a hawk. It was strangely soothing. Cars drifting past, a stray cat weaving between lawns, sprinklers hissing to life in the distance. Hours passed with nothing unusual, but I wasn't bored. Alex would have called it paranoia. I called it preparation. I wasn't just watching. I was hunting, waiting for the next move. I knew they wouldn't stop. Their pride wouldn't allow it. They needed to remind me that they were in control, that no camera could stop them. I just had to be ready when they slipped up. I was about to call it a night, my eyes raw and aching, when something shifted on the screen pointed down the street. A plain white work van I didn't recognize pulled up and parked quietly a few houses away from Karen's. It was well past midnight. The driver's door creaked open and a man stepped out, just a dark figure under the flickering street lamp. My heart thudded as I leaned in, watching him head straight for Karen's house. Moments later, her front door opened. But it wasn't Karen. It wasn't Kyle. It was Bob, her pudgy, soft-spoken husband who rarely said a word at meetings, the HOA treasurer who always looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He stepped outside with hesitation, eyes darting nervously along the street, then walked down to meet the man from the van at the end of his driveway. I couldn't hear what they said, but I didn't need to. Their hands were doing all the talking that I watched, barely breathing, as the man from the van handed Bob a thick, white envelope. Clean, deliberate, unmistakable. Bob quickly tucked it inside his jacket like it was contraband, then handed something small back to the man, likely a check. They shook hands with the stiff awkwardness of people doing something they knew was wrong. And just like that, the man returned to his van and drove off into the night. Bob scurried back inside like nothing had happened, but I knew better. My pulse was racing. This wasn't just some innocent late-night chat. It was a transaction, a secretive exchange they clearly didn't want witnessed. I immediately saved the video file, adrenaline surging as my mind spiraled with questions. What was in the envelope? Who was that man? I didn't have all the answers, but I felt it. A crack in the brick wall I'd been slamming into for weeks. The cameras I'd put up to catch a smug teenager had just exposed something far more serious. I didn't know exactly what I had stumbled into, but deep down, I knew this was it. This was the key to everything. That scene burned itself into my memory. The nervous look on Bob's face, the thick envelope, the silent deal under the cover of night. Something about it felt rotten to the core. I watched the footage over and over, zooming, analyzing, obsessing. That's when I caught it. A partial license plate, and, even better, a blurry but legible logo on the side of the van, Prestige Landscaping. My breath hitched. Landscaping. I pulled up the HOA budgets I had already downloaded and searched for. The name. There it was, plain as day. Prestige Landscaping had been the official HOA contractor for 2 years, the exact same 2 years Karen had been president, and during that time, the landscaping budget had mysteriously exploded by 30%. Suddenly, it all started to make sense. The vague community enhancement line items, the inflated costs, the subpar maintenance work. This wasn't about nicer lawns or prettier flowers. It was a kickback scheme. The contractor jacked up the prices for minimal or fake services, and someone on the inside got a cut of the extra cash. Bob was the treasurer, the one signing the checks, but I knew, just knew in my bones, that the mastermind behind it all was Karen. This scheme was Karen's personal piggy bank, her quiet little empire of stolen funds, and as that realization settled over me, I felt a grim, almost cold satisfaction, because now I had the weapon I needed. This wasn't just petty vandalism anymore. This was fraud, plain and simple. This was embezzlement. This was the kind of crime that didn't end in HOA fines. It ended in courtrooms and jail time. Suddenly, the joy ride, the damage to my car, the nail in my tire, none of it seemed random. It all clicked into place with sickening clarity. Months ago, at that infamous HOA meeting, I had been the only one to raise a hand and question the budget, to ask for details everyone else was too afraid or too bored to demand. I hadn't known it then, but that simple question had made me a threat. I had poked a stick into their carefully hidden corruption, and they couldn't afford to let that go. Karen did what she always did, used fear, used her influence, and in this case, used her son like a weapon. She probably told him to teach that Mustang guy a lesson, to knock me down a peg and scare me off the scent. They went after the one thing I loved most to make sure I wouldn't look any closer. But the irony, thick and bitter, was that their attempt to silence me had only lit a fire under me. In trying to intimidate me, they drove me straight to the truth. Their arrogance, so deeply rooted in years of unchecked power, was going to be the very thing that destroyed them. Without hesitation, I called Alex. I laid everything out, the video footage, the landscaping company, the padded budgets. For a long moment, there was silence. Then his voice came through, low and serious. "Jack," he said, "this is massive. This is way beyond an HOA spat now. This is criminal. You've got to take it to the police. The district attorney." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "I know," I said quietly, "but what happens next? They'll launch an investigation, sure, but it could drag on for months, maybe years. Karen and Bob will lawyer up with people who charge by the minute. They'll bury it in legal filings and technicalities. They'll spin it as a miscommunication or clerical error. By the time it ends, no one will care. Maybe they'll pay a fine. Maybe get probation. That's not justice." Alex was firm. "That's the system. It's not perfect, but it's the right way. You have the truth, Jack. Now let the law take it from here." I glanced around my garage, my eyes landing on the mangled fender of my Mustang leaning against the wall like a twisted memorial to their arrogance and disrespect. It wasn't just metal. It was a symbol of everything they had taken from me, tried to silence in me. I thought about Louis, peeking nervously from behind his curtains, too scared to step fully into his own life. I thought about the smug, self-satisfied looks on Karen's and Kyle's faces, so sure of their untouchable status. The idea of going through the proper channels suddenly felt hollow, cold, bureaucratic, detached. It wasn't justice, it was a compromise. And I wasn't interested in compromising. Not now. "No," I said aloud, the decision hardening inside me like steel. "If I just hand this over, they'll spin it, hide behind lawyers and procedures, paint themselves as victims of the system. But I don't want them to be victims of the system. I want them to fall on their own swords. I want every homeowner they bullied, every neighbor they silenced, to see them laid bare for what they really are. I want to strip away not just their power, but their image, their status, their carefully cultivated lie. I want to do it in the open." "What are you talking about?" Alex asked, his voice edged with concern. "What are you planning?" I took a breath and said it plainly. "I'm going to give them exactly what they deserve, not just legal consequences, but public humiliation. I'm going to tear down their kingdom brick by brick, and I'm going to do it where everyone can. Watch." There was a heavy pause, and then Alex warned me. "Jack, that's a dangerous game. There's a fine line between justice and revenge, and you're walking it." "Maybe it's meant to be blurry," I replied without hesitation. "They made it personal when they went after me. I'm just finishing what they started. They wanted to teach me a lesson? Well, class is about to be in session, and this time, I'm the one handing out grades." I hung up before he could talk me out of it. I knew Alex meant well. He was my best friend, and he was thinking like a lawyer. But I wasn't thinking like a lawyer. I was thinking like someone who had been pushed too far, someone whose patience had been worn down to its last nerve. I wasn't going to act out of rage. I was beyond that now. Cold clarity had taken over. Methodical, precise. I would take my time. I would build a case so damning, so flawless, that when it finally dropped, it would land like a bomb in the middle of Karen's manicured, pristine little world. The fire of my anger had been replaced by a sharpened, focused flame. The fire of my anger had been forged into the sharp, cold steel of a plan, and the question of law versus revenge had dissolved entirely. It wasn't a choice anymore. It was a strategy. I was going to use the law not as a shield, but as a sword, wielding it with the precision of a surgeon and the intent of a man scorned. And when it landed, it was going to be beautiful. The first step was done. I had the truth. Now I needed the perfect way to deploy it. The line between justice and vengeance wasn't a line anymore. It was a road, and I was speeding down it with my foot on the gas and no intention of slowing down. My anger hadn't faded. It had transformed into pure fuel, powering the calm, calculated part of me that now took over. The financial fraud was big, massive, even, but it was too abstract, too distant. To bring Karen's little empire crashing down, I needed to make it personal. I needed to connect her corruption to the lives of the people she had manipulated and controlled. I had to show her loyal subjects just how deeply she had betrayed them. And for that, I needed allies. An army. The first recruit. The last person anyone would expect, Louis. I walked over to his house, not with a plea, but with a promise. I found him outside, nervously trimming a rose bush like a man constantly expecting a scolding. "Louis," I said softly, steadying my voice. "You don't have to be afraid anymore." He flinched, dropping a leaf he had just clipped. I don't know what you're talking about," he muttered. "I do," I replied. "I know about the kickbacks. Prestige landscaping. I have proof Karen and Bob have been embezzling HOA money for years." His eyes widened in terror, and he glanced around as if Karen might burst out from behind a lawn gnome with a citation in hand. "You do?" he whispered, like the words themselves could get him fined. "I do," I confirmed, "and I'm going to expose them. But I need your help, to help everyone else. Think, Louis. Has Karen ever hit you with something unfair? Anything you knew was personal?" His face shifted, something changed. A flicker of emotion sparked behind his eyes, and for the first time since I'd known him, I saw it. Anger. "The petunias," he said, almost growling. "Last year she fined me $200. Said they were a non-conforming shade of pink. I had to rip them all out." My wife cried. "She loved those flowers," Louis said softly, his voice heavy, with the weight of old anger. "Did you get a formal violation notice?" I asked. "Yes," he nodded quickly. "I kept it. I keep everything." I smiled. "Perfect. Can you get me a copy? Anonymously. Just leave it in my mailbox tonight. Your name will never appear anywhere. This isn't just about me, Louis. I'm building something bigger." He hesitated for a heartbeat, then something inside him shifted. His shoulders straightened, his voice steadied. "Okay," he said. "Okay, I'll do it." And there it was, the key I needed: anonymity. It gave people just enough courage to stand up without putting themselves in the firing line. Over the next 2 weeks, I worked quietly, deliberately, approaching other neighbors one at a time. I found Mrs. Henderson, the sweet older woman whose award-winning flower bed had been flattened when my Mustang was vandalized. Instead of sympathy, Karen fined her for failure to protect community property. I spoke with the Millers, fined over their son's basketball hoop because the backboard was the wrong shade of gray. I talked to Mr. Gable, who had been forced to repaint his front door because Karen decided the blue he used was too cheerful and disruptive. Each time, I followed the same script. I told them I was investigating the HOA's abuses, promised absolute confidentiality, and asked only for their stories and any paperwork they had. Fear had kept people quiet for years, but the promise of anonymous revenge, of finally seeing Karen held accountable, was a powerful motivator. Slowly, carefully, the evidence began flowing in. Envelopes were slipped under my door at midnight, left in my mailbox without a name. I collected absurd violation letters, unfair fines, records of petty control. I was building an arsenal of HOA tyranny, piece by piece. But while I gathered those stories, I was also digging deeper into the heart of the fraud. I investigated Prestige Landscaping, found their corporate filings, traced ownership, and discovered the company belonged to a man named Gus Maroney. That name led me to social media, and from there, it didn't take long. Gus's wife had a public profile, overflowing with photos from vacations, dinner parties, and celebrations. In one album from 2 years ago, a tropical getaway in the Bahamas, there they were, Gus and his wife, smiling at dinner with another couple, Karen and Bob. The caption read, "Amazing time in the Bahamas with our dear friends, the best HOA president ever." These weren't just business associates. They were close, personal friends. They were friends who vacationed together in tropical paradises while the rest of us paid inflated HOA fees for landscaping that barely touched our lawns. That photo, grinning over drinks in the Bahamas, was the final nail in the coffin. It confirmed what I already suspected. Their relationship wasn't professional, it was personal, too close for comfort between a contractor and the HOA president. With that, I had all the pieces I needed. The video of the late-night envelope exchange, the bloated budgets, the cozy friendship with the contractor, and a thick stack of violation letters detailing Karen's cruel, obsessive need to control and punish her neighbors. It was time to bring it all together and aim it straight at the heart of her empire. I bought a burner phone and created a fresh email address to keep everything untraceable. I wasn't about to waste this opportunity on another powerless HOA meeting where Karen ruled the room. I needed something bigger, public, undeniable. I spent an entire day assembling an information packet, laying it out in clean, simple language, written so clearly even a third grader could follow it. Page 1 was all about the money. A timeline of budget increases paired with a screenshot of that Bahamas vacation photo and a still frame from my security footage showing Bob receiving the envelope. Page 2 cataloged her abuse of power, real. Violation letters, photos of $200 fines for flower color, $100 penalties for cheerful doors. It was a printed gallery of her petty tyranny. Page 3 was about my Mustang, photos of the damage, the story of Kyle's vandalism, and how it was part of a coordinated effort to scare me away from the truth. The final page was the call to action, bold, direct. It's time to take back our neighborhood. My plan was simple and ruthlessly calculated. I used the burner phone to send a mass text and email to every resident in the HOA, presenting myself as part of a grassroots group, the Neighborhood Watch for Fair Governance. The message announced an emergency community safety meeting at the local hall, scheduled for 3 days later. The topic? Financial mismanagement and leadership concerns in the HOA. I knew Karen would see it, and I knew exactly how she'd react. She'd think it was a weak, disorganized attempt by a few disgruntled residents. She'd show up, confident, ready to intimidate and dominate like always. But this meeting wasn't for her. It was for everyone else. It was for the people she'd walked over for years. And I had invited a very special audience. I spent that afternoon calling every major news outlet, local TV stations, and community papers, reaching out specifically to their investigative reporters, the ones who lived for suburban corruption exposés. I used my burner phone and introduced myself as Mr. Smith. I told the reporters I had a hot tip about a local HOA president tangled in a massive kickback scheme, and that it was all going to erupt at a public meeting, an explosive moment they wouldn't want to miss. "Bring your cameras," I said, letting the bait dangle just right. The trap was officially set. My information packets, printed, stapled, and stacked neatly in a box in my garage, were ready to go. The neighborhood was buzzing with whispers, texts, and phone calls about the mysterious emergency meeting. Curiosity was high, suspicion was rising, and Karen, undoubtedly, was preparing to march in, heels clicking with self-importance, expecting to squash a minor rebellion like she had so many times before. What she didn't realize was that this wasn't just a meeting. This was her downfall, and she was the headliner at her own public execution. Alex's words echoed faintly in the back of my mind, about that thin, wavering line between justice and revenge. But I'd crossed it long ago, and I hadn't looked back once. I wasn't the victim anymore. I was the architect, the hunter, and my prey was walking straight into the snare I'd laid with precision and purpose. The night of the meeting, the community hall pulsed with energy. It wasn't the usual crowd of disengaged, nervous homeowners. There were fresh faces, people who never showed up to anything, drawn by the scent of conflict and the promise of truth. I arrived early, my box of packets in hand, Alex beside me. He'd argued, reasoned, begged me to reconsider the plan, but when it became clear I wouldn't back down, he'd sighed and said, "All right, if you're doing this, I'm with you. Someone's got to make sure you don't land yourself in jail." That loyalty, solid, unwavering, meant more to me than I could ever say. And we weren't the only early arrivals. In the back, feigning casual interest, were 2 camera crews and several reporters scribbling in notepads. My anonymous tip had worked. Media sharks had picked up the scent of scandal. As residents trickled in, I moved through the room quietly, handing each of them a packet. "Read this before the meeting starts," I said in a hushed tone. It's time we all knew the truth. As pages turned, the room shifted. The typical tension, that quiet fear Karen had cultivated like a toxic garden, began to morph. Murmurs spread. Gasps followed. Fingers pointed at photos and emails and budget charts. I knew it. One woman whispered to her husband, "That landscaping bill never made sense." One by one, the pieces fell into place for them. What had once felt like isolated acts of harassment or arbitrary fines were now clearly part of a larger, orchestrated scheme of control and corruption. The power that Karen had wielded so confidently was cracking, fracturing as her neighbors began to see her not as an authority figure, but as a fraud. And then, right on cue, the doors to the hall burst open. Karen strode into the hall like a general marching into battle, flanked on either side by Bob and Kyle, all three of them dressed to impress, armored in smug confidence. She wore that trademark, condescending smile, the one she used right before steamrolling someone into silence. But the moment she stepped past the threshold and took in the room, she hesitated. This wasn't the usual meek cluster of homeowners nervously sipping water and avoiding eye contact. This was a packed house, a crowd simmering with barely restrained fury. Her smile twitched. Her eyes darted to the back, where cameras gleamed and reporters stood with notepads ready. I saw it. The flicker, small but undeniable. Panic. Then she spotted me at the side of the room. Our eyes locked, and the panic crystallized into something else. Rage, cold and burning. She knew. She knew exactly who had orchestrated this ambush. But before she could speak, I stepped forward, voice clear and unwavering. "Thank you all for coming," I said, projecting calm confidence. "For far too long, this community has been managed not in our interests, but for the personal benefit of one family. In your hands is the evidence, proof of fraud, intimidation, and abuse of power." Karen snapped. "This is slander," she shrieked, her voice cracking as she pointed a shaking finger at me. "He's lying. He's a disgruntled resident with a personal vendetta. He's angry because he was fined for breaking the rules." Her voice echoed off the walls, shrill and frantic. But she was too late. The reporters swarmed forward, cameras rolling, mics extended like spears. "Mrs. President," one of them called out, "can you comment on the alleged kickback scheme with Prestige Landscaping? Is this photo of you and your husband on vacation with the owner authentic?" Bob looked like he might pass out, sweat beading on his forehead as his face drained of color. Kyle stood frozen, eyes wide, mouth slightly open, the usual cocky smirk completely gone. For the first time, he seemed to realize that mommy couldn't fix this one. "I'm not answering questions based on this garbage," Karen snapped, grabbing a packet from a table and ripping it in half with dramatic flair. "This is a setup." "Lies," she bellowed. She was clinging to her power the only way she knew. How? By shouting louder, pretending harder. It was her word against mine, and for years that had been enough. She had relied on fear, silence, and authority, but she hadn't anticipated the strength of a room full of people who had finally seen the truth and had finally seen each other. She forgot what fear turns into when it snaps. She forgot about courage. And then, something no one expected happened. A hand rose slowly in the crowd. Shaky, unsure, yet impossible to ignore. It was neighbor Louis, clutching the information. Packet to his chest like it was the only thing anchoring him. He looked terrified, trembling from head to toe, but he was standing, and that alone sent a ripple through the room. All eyes turned to him. It's not just the money," he began, voice soft but clear in the heavy silence. His gaze locked on Karen before shifting to Kyle, and with a deep, trembling breath, he said, "It's about what you told him to do." A confused murmur swept through the room. Karen stared at him, bewildered, as if he'd risen from the dead. "What are you talking about, you old fool?" she snapped, her voice sharp, but Louis didn't back down. He pointed a shaking finger at Kyle. "I saw you," he said, voice growing steadier with each word. "That night, when you took the car, I saw you from my window. You and your friends, you were laughing." Kyle tried to sound tough. "So, what? I was just having fun." But Louis shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "It wasn't just fun. I heard what you said. Your friends asked if you were scared about getting caught, and you told them something I'll never forget. I heard you, clear as day." He took another breath, the room leaning in, holding their collective breath as the words came out. "You said, don't worry about it. My mom told me to do it. She told me to teach that Mustang guy a lesson for asking about the budget. She said to have some fun with it and make sure he gets the message." Gasps exploded around the room like a gunshot. This wasn't just petty HOA drama anymore. It was conspiracy. Louis had connected the dots for everyone, and suddenly, This wasn't a reckless teen's prank or a few shady accounting tricks. This was Karen, the HOA president, ordering an intentional act of vandalism to silence a resident for daring to hold her accountable. The reporters surged forward, cameras flashing wildly, questions flying through the air like arrows. Karen's furious mask cracked in real time, all composure drained from her face, leaving behind the unmistakable look of someone who had just realized the walls were closing in. This wasn't just public embarrassment anymore. This was criminal. She had walked straight into a trap, and the moment Louis spoke, the door slammed shut behind her with finality. But what came next rocked the entire room. Louis's words hung like a storm cloud, thick with tension, and in the silence that followed, it was as if the air had been sucked from the hall. The weight of his accusation, so pointed, so devastating, stunned the room into a stunned hush. Then, the silence shattered. Chaos erupted as reporters surged forward, questions firing like bullets. Did you tell your son to destroy property? Is this how the HOA handles dissent? Karen, flustered and cornered, looked around in wild desperation. Louis, the cameras, me. Her usual arsenal of manipulation utterly useless. The gavel she used to silence objections couldn't help her now. The bylaws she twisted to her had no power in this storm. Stripped of control, her voice rose in a shrill, cracking scream. He's lying. That old man is confused. He's making it up. But no one believed her. The denial was flimsy, desperate, a crumbling dam against a rising tide. And Louis? The man who had trembled moments ago now stood firm, his spine straightened by truth. I am not confused, he declared, voice calm, resolute. I know what I heard. And then, out of nowhere, came the twist no one could have seen coming. Another voice, hesitant but unmistakably real, rang out from the back. He's not the only one who heard it. Heads turned. It was Mark, one of Kyle's own friends, pale, wide-eyed, standing frozen in the glow of the cameras. Kyle's face twisted in panic. Don't say anything, man, he hissed. But Mark ignored him. His feet moved forward as if pulled by gravity, and soon he stood beside Louis, trembling but firm. It's true, he said, voice soft but damning. Kyle bragged about it. Said his mom was pissed at that guy, he pointed to me, and told him to mess with the car so he'd back off. A collective gasp swept through the room. Louis's testimony had been a lightning strike, but this was the explosion. That followed, confirmation from Kyle's own circle. The room reeled. The reporters leaned in even harder, their microphones now inches away from Karen's face. Kyle looked ghostly, as if every ounce of blood had drained from him. His eyes, locked with his mother's, pleading, terrified, silently begging for her to do what she always did. Fix it, bury it, make it go away. But this time, there was nothing she could do, but Karen couldn't fix this. Not now, not ever. She was broken, unraveling in real time before an audience she had once ruled through fear. The expression on her face was one I knew I would cherish for the rest of my life. The smug superiority, the relentless confidence, the cold control, all of it had dissolved, revealing a sniveling, pitiful bully exposed in front of her entire kingdom. She looked small, lost, utterly powerless. And then, like a dam cracking under years of pressure, the fear that had gripped our neighborhood for so long finally shattered. Mrs. Henderson, the same woman whose petunias had been crushed by my Mustang, stood up and pointed directly at Karen. She fined me for the damage his son caused, she shouted, her voice shaking with long-suppressed rage. Then Mr. Gable stood up too. She made me repaint my door 3 times, because she didn't like the color. And just like that, one by one, residents across the room began rising, people I had spoken to, and even those I hadn't, each of them raising their voices, yelling over each other with story after story of her petty cruelty. The info packets I had once nervously handed out were now being waved in the air like rally flags, symbols of collective defiance. The fear was gone, replaced by anger and long overdue courage. I had shown them she could bleed, and now they wanted justice. No, vengeance. This was it, the climax of my plan. But the wild beauty of it was that it had grown beyond me. This wasn't just my mission anymore. It had become a revolution. Karen, Bob, and Kyle stood surrounded, an island of panic. In a roaring sea of fury and flashing news cameras, Bob looked frozen, his eyes glazed as if he'd short-circuited. Kyle was crying now, fat tears trailing silently down his face. No longer the cocky prince of HOA privilege, just a boy realizing his fortress had crumbled. Then Karen tried to run. She shoved past reporters, lunging toward the exit, but she didn't get far. The homeowners, my neighbors, closed ranks around her, not with violence, but with quiet, impenetrable resolve. They simply stood, arms folded, bodies firm, forming a wall of moral resistance. She was trapped, and she knew it. She spun back around, her face a twisted mask of desperation and hatred, and locked eyes with me. Her gaze was pure venom, her lips curled back in a scream of my name, raw, guttural, animalistic. But I didn't move. I didn't smirk. I just stared back, steady and cold, letting her see the truth. I was the one who did this. I was the one who took everything she built and dismantled it piece by piece. And then, just when it seemed the room couldn't hold any more tension, the doors at the back swung open once more, and this time, it wasn't a neighbor stepping in. It was two uniformed police officers who stepped through the doors, my final chess move executed flawlessly. Before the meeting, I'd made one last anonymous call from my burner phone, not to report a crime, but to warn of a major public disturbance brewing at the community hall, hinting at a volatile situation that might require police presence. And now, right on cue, they were here. The room fell into hushed silence as the officers scanned the scene, a hall packed with angry residents, flashing cameras, and a visibly shaken HOA board. One of the reporters moved quickly, handing an info packet to the senior officer. "We have multiple witnesses to a conspiracy involving vandalism and a major embezzlement scheme," he said. The officer's eyes swept over the packet. Vacation photos, inflated budgets, surveillance stills. Then he looked up, locking eyes with Karen, with Lewis and Mark, and finally, with me. I gave him a slow, deliberate nod. That was enough. "Okay," the officer said, calm but firm. "We're going to need to take some statements." Then, turning squarely to Karen, Bob, and Kyle, he added, "I need the three of you to come with me. We have some questions for you down at the station." The room exhaled in one massive release. The finality in his voice was irrefutable. The reign of terror was over. The queen had fallen, not in a dusty courtroom months down the line, but right here, in the very heart of her dominion, in front of every soul she had tried to dominate. As the police led Karen and her family from the hall, dazed and silent, the room erupted. Cheers, applause, even laughter from residents finally unburdened. Alex clapped a hand on my shoulder, beaming. "You did it, you crazy son of a gun," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "You actually did it." Outside, flashing police lights painted streaks of red and blue across the building, casting long shadows over the wreckage of Karen's crumbled empire. I watched her go with no malice, only the cold, clear satisfaction of justice done. What I had sparked was more than revenge. It was a restoration of truth, a community reclaiming its voice. It was balance. In the months that followed, the entire sordid affair unraveled just as I'd envisioned. Faced with overwhelming evidence and damning witness accounts, Karen, Bob, and Kyle had no choice but to fold. Their expensive lawyers scrambled to strike a deal, and soon the whole family pled guilty to a stack of charges: conspiracy, insurance fraud, embezzlement. Kyle got off with community service and a permanent stain on his juvenile record, a reminder that his mother's power could no longer shield him. Bob lost his accounting license and was sentenced to 5 years of probation, his professional reputation in ruins. But it was Karen, the ringleader, the puppeteer, who bore the heaviest consequence. The judge, clearly determined to make an example out of her, handed down a 2-year state prison sentence. The day she was led away in handcuffs, crying and disheveled, her photo made the front page of the local newspaper. I bought a copy, framed it, and hung it in my garage like a trophy. Soon after, a court order officially dissolved the corrupt HOA. In its place, a new, simpler community association rose from the ashes, one built on transparency, term limits, and democratic control. The money recovered from the kickback scheme and civil suits was surprisingly substantial, enough to reverse every absurd fine Karen had ever levied, with interest, and pay off all the legal fees. More than that, It covered the complete nut and bolt restoration of my beloved Mustang. For months, I spent my evenings in the garage, not consumed by anger, but grounded in peace, as I slowly rebuilt her. Every dent was erased, every scar replaced, every inch repainted in a deep, mesmerizing black that seemed to swallow the light. When she was done, she wasn't just a car anymore. She was a monument, not to what had been destroyed, but to what had been reclaimed. One bright Saturday, as I gave her a final polish, Alex wandered in with 2 cold beers. He leaned casually against the garage door, eyeing the gleaming car before looking over at me. "So," he said, handing me a bottle, "I've been meaning to ask you, after everything, was it about justice, or was it about revenge?" I paused, letting his words settle as I stared into the polished chrome of the bumper. My reflection stared back, eyes steady and clear. I thought of the fire that had once burned in me, the ruthless precision of the trap I'd set, the raw collapse of Karen's world. I took a slow drink, the beer crisp and cold, and a quiet smile crept onto my lips. "I used the law," I said, my voice calm and certain, "to get my revenge." And then, with a nod to the Mustang and everything it represented, I added, "And you know what?